Simon Ford had long given up on the idea of making a great scientific discovery. His career in physics had peaked years ago, and now he was merely a fixture at the University of North Carolina, an eccentric, middle-aged scientist known more for his disheveled appearance and obscure theories than for any tangible contributions to the world. The young graduate students who stumbled into his office often made the mistake of thinking he was a relic, a man whose glory days were behind him. They'd ask about his research with polite curiosity, only for Simon to mumble something about gravitational anomalies or the possibility of multiple dimensions. Nonsense. They'd smile, politely nodding as they walked away, eager to talk to someone with an actual grant or, at the very least, a functional laboratory. But today was different. Simon was fiddling with his latest project, an experimental machine designed to manipulate gravity in subtle ways. It wasn't supposed to do anything groundbreaking, just a small tweak in gravitational fields to observe how objects might behave. He'd lost interest in it himself, but the machine was still humming softly in his lab, its various wires and buttons connected to an array of sensors. A small display flickered in front of him, showing graphs that barely made sense, and Simon absent-mindedly scribbled notes. He didn't expect anything extraordinary to happen today. He hadn't expected anything extraordinary to happen in years, but something did. A sudden spark shot from the machine. It buzzed like an angry hornet and then fell silent. For a second, Simon thought the machine had short-circuited. He stood up quickly, muttering to himself, but then he noticed something odd. The air around him seemed different. Not colder, not warmer, just different. A shift. He looked around. His office looked the same, the walls cluttered with books, the floor covered in a mess of papers and discarded coffee cups. Yet something about it felt slightly off, as if the very space around him had distorted, just a little. Simon took a cautious step forward and bumped into a chair. But instead of falling like it should have, the chair floated just slightly above the floor, as if weightless. His heart skipped. What on earth? He reached for his desk, and as his hand brushed the surface, the papers on it didn't stay in place. They hovered, defying gravity, and drifted toward the ceiling. A soft gasp escaped Simon's lips. This wasn't possible. He hadn't done anything that would cause, whatever this was. A sudden realization hit him like a freight train. The machine. The gravitational field. Had it somehow? No. It couldn't have. Could it? Was it even remotely possible to affect gravity on such a scale? Simon turned and bolted out of the lab. His breath was shallow, his heart racing. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed a group of students walking toward him. They didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but as Simon looked closer, he realized that they were walking at an odd angle, as if gravity were pulling them in the wrong direction. The floor underfoot seemed to tilt slightly, making the whole scene seem wrong. He staggered backward, then realized he was standing on a wall. His head spun as he tried to get his bearings. The students passed, none of them acknowledging him. It was as though the world had tilted just enough that the smallest shifts in gravity were now normal to them. He grabbed his phone from his pocket, hands shaking, and opened the news app. Headlines filled the screen, but one caught his eye: strange phenomenon detected across the world, unexplained gravity fluctuations. What was happening? The reports were vague, referencing strange gravitational anomalies that had been detected in cities all over the world. As Simon read, the words began to sink in. Earth itself, somehow, had experienced a shift in gravity. The world wasn't just tilted. Something deeper, more profound, was going on. He rushed to the university's physics department, nearly tripping over his own feet as he ran. His mind buzzed with 1,000 questions, but one thing was certain: the machine he had created wasn't just malfunctioning. It had somehow triggered a massive shift in the very fabric of reality. It had caused something. Simon wasn't sure what. But he needed answers. When he finally reached the department, the halls were alive with chaos. Professors and students gathered in clusters, murmuring about the strange effects they had all noticed. Some theorized it was an elaborate hoax. Others believed it was a government experiment gone wrong. But Simon knew better. He had done this. His machine, the thought, was too large to grasp in a moment of panic, but Simon was no fool. He sprinted back to his lab, leaving a trail of disoriented students behind him, and slammed open the door. The machine was silent now, its display flickering weakly. He knelt down in front of it, muttering to himself as he tried to make sense of the readings. It wasn't just a localized anomaly. His machine had done something far worse. It had created an entirely new world. As he stared at the screen, Simon could see it, a mirrored world, an alternate Earth with gravity reversed. It was as though the world he had known had split, creating a reflection that was both identical and profoundly different. Mountains, oceans, cities, everything appeared, but each in a mirrored version of its former self, and somehow, that world was starting to replace his own. Simon's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know how to stop it. Worse, he didn't know if he should. The next few days were a blur of frantic research and increasingly baffling phenomena. Simon spent every waking hour trying to understand what he had done. His once peaceful life was now consumed by the aftermath of his experiment. Scientists, both local and international, began to take notice, and they descended upon his lab, eager to learn more about the strange fluctuations in gravity he had caused. Meanwhile, the mirrored world continued to grow, slowly but steadily. The differences were subtle at first. People still walked upright, buildings still stood firm, but the gravitational effects were slowly becoming more pronounced. Roads twisted in odd directions, trees grew sideways, and water flowed against its natural course. In some places, objects would simply hover above the ground, defying the rules of physics as Simon understood them. The strangest part was that, despite the oddities, the world still functioned, still felt normal, at least to those living in it. People went about their days as if everything were just slightly off. It was only when Simon encountered people from the mirrored world that the magnitude of the shift hit him. He had visited the university again, speaking with his colleagues about what was happening. It was clear to Simon that there was more at stake than just his personal reputation. The mirror world wasn't just an anomaly, it was a new reality, and it was growing. Worse, it was starting to merge with the original Earth in ways Simon hadn't anticipated. And then, he met Lydia. Lydia was a physicist from the mirrored Earth, although she hadn't called it that, not yet. She had contacted Simon after seeing his research and reaching out to him through a secure channel. She was intelligent, witty, and sharp. But she was also struggling with the same question that haunted Simon. What did it all mean? What we're seeing, Lydia told Simon over their first video call, isn't just some scientific curiosity. It's a full-blown existence. This world isn't just in our world, it's with our world, and that's the problem. Simon leaned forward in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. You're saying it's replacing ours? No, Lydia said with a sigh. It's not replacing it. It's becoming it. And the more we resist, the more it tries to push us out. The notion rattled Simon, but at the same time, it was oddly comforting. For the first time, someone else understood. Someone who wasn't just looking at this from the perspective of a mad scientist who'd lost control. Why don't we just destroy it? Simon suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. If we can shut down the machine, shut down the gravity flux, the problem goes away. Lydia looked at him with narrowed eyes, her expression unreadable. What if it doesn't? What if destroying it only creates more of these ripples? What if we can't put it back in the box? Simon felt a chill run down his spine. She was right. If he destroyed it, what would happen to the people in the mirror world? What would happen to the one he'd been living in? I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what to do anymore. Lydia sighed and rubbed her eyes. Neither do I. But we have to make a choice soon. The longer we let this go on, the more it grows. Simon sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. Lydia's face, lit up by the glow of her own lab, mirrored his own exhaustion. He was starting to realize that there was no easy solution to what they were dealing with. Every instinct he had told him to shut it all down, destroy the machine, stop the gravity anomaly, and restore things to the way they were. But Lydia's words echoed in his mind. What if we can't put it back in the box? The world in the mirror wasn't just an image or a glitch, it was a living, breathing alternate reality. And as much as Simon hated to admit it, there was a part of him that saw it as something beautiful, something worthy of preservation. But another part of him, the scientist, the man who had caused all of this, knew the weight of his actions. He had created this world, and now he had to live with it. I need to go back, Simon muttered to Lydia, more to himself than to her. Back to the machine? She asked, leaning forward, her brow furrowing. You think you can just turn it off and make everything go back to normal? No, Simon said, shaking his head. I don't think I can. But I have to try. The gravity in his chest felt heavier than it had in weeks. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to end the conversation and make the decision that would either save or destroy two worlds. But there was one more question he needed to ask, one that had been gnawing at him for days. What if, Simon said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, what if the two worlds could coexist? Lydia blinked at him. You mean, just let them be? Let them run parallel? Simon exhaled sharply. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe that's the only answer. But, what would that mean? If the worlds coexist, does one start replacing the other? Do we lose our place in the hierarchy of existence? Lydia remained silent for a long moment, her eyes focused on the screen, as if weighing the impossible. I don't know, Simon, she finally said. But I do know that we're running out of time. He couldn't argue with that. The mirror world was already starting to bleed into his own in ways that couldn't be ignored. The strange gravitational effects were no longer just confined to isolated pockets of the Earth. They were beginning to affect larger areas. Cityscapes were warped, time seemed to stretch oddly in certain locations, and objects from one world began flickering in and out of existence in the other. It was as if the worlds were becoming more like one another, inching toward fusion instead of coexistence. Simon didn't have the answers, but he couldn't ignore the fact that the mirror world seemed almost better in some ways. There was no denying it. The environmental changes that had been ravaging Earth were almost non-existent in the mirror world. Rivers flowed in reverse, yes, but they were cleaner. There was no pollution clogging the air, no toxic smog. The people there, those few he had managed to meet through Lydia, were more in tune with the planet. They seemed to operate on a different set of values, more sustainable, more community-driven. It was a world that, despite its oddness, seemed to have found a balance. He looked at Lydia, who was waiting for him to make up his mind. But Simon was no closer to a decision. The conflict was unbearable. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the two worlds were not simply mirroring each other, they were converging. And he had no way of stopping it. As if on cue, Simon's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He fumbled for it, checking the message that had just come through. His heart dropped. It was from his colleague, Dr. Rebecca Harris, who had been monitoring the global gravitational fluctuations from a research facility in Greenland. Simon, this is bad. The gravity shifts are accelerating. The mirror world is pushing through. You need to act fast. That was all it said. No explanation. No additional information. Just a warning. Simon sat still for a moment, his mind racing. He had to act. But how? How could he fix something this large, this uncontrollable? He wasn't even sure if it could be fixed at all. He had to face the truth. There was no undoing what had been done. I have to go, he told Lydia, his voice sharp with the urgency he hadn't realized was building inside him. I'll do what I can. But I'm not sure what that will look like. Lydia's expression softened, but her eyes still held that same intensity. Just be careful, Simon. I don't think either world can survive if you're not. Simon didn't respond. Instead, he ended the call and stood up, pacing his small office. The machine hummed softly, almost beckoning him to return. He wasn't sure what he would find when he got there, but he knew one thing: this was the point of no return. He gathered his things quickly, throwing on his jacket and grabbing the emergency shutdown codes for the machine, just in case he needed them. He didn't trust his memory anymore. He didn't trust anything. By the time he reached the lab, the world outside had begun to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. The sky above was clouded with strange, swirling patterns, almost as if it were folding in on itself. People moved through the streets in a kind of slow motion, their movements jerky, like they were walking on an uneven surface. Simon's breath caught in his throat. The anomaly had grown. It was no longer just an academic problem. It was a global one. The machine was waiting for him, silent but ominous. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding. The device was still emitting strange energy readings, flashing on and off in a series of complex codes. He had no idea how it worked or even if it could still be turned off, but he had to try. He punched in the emergency shutdown sequence, his hands trembling. The machine sparked, flickered, and hummed once more before finally going silent. The lights above him dimmed, but the world outside didn't change. It continued to shift and warp, as if the mirror world was still pressing through. Simon stared at the machine for a long moment, realizing the horrible truth: shutting it down might not be enough. He had tampered with forces too large to control, too deep to erase. It wasn't the mirror world that was the problem anymore. It was the very nature of existence itself that was at stake. Could two realities, two worlds, really coexist? Could he stand by and let them try? The answer, Simon realized with an icy certainty, was something that couldn't be decided by science alone. It was something far larger than his experiment. He had opened a door, and now he had to choose: destroy it, or let both worlds live side by side, for better or for worse. Simon took one last look at the screen. The mirrored world was still there. And it wasn't going away. The weeks that followed were nothing short of chaotic. As Simon continued to study the machine, trying to make sense of the anomaly he had unleashed, the world around him seemed to spiral further into uncertainty. The mirrored world, though still invisible to most, was now pressing its influence more and more onto the original Earth. Gravity shifts, subtle at first, were now becoming full-blown disruptions in the fabric of reality. Simon had expected some residual effects after shutting down the machine, but nothing like this. Entire cities had begun to experience gravitational fluxes. The ground would tilt unexpectedly, buildings appeared to grow larger or smaller in an instant, and people walked through streets that felt as though they were sliding sideways. The government, along with military and scientific organizations, had started to intervene, but there was no clear explanation for what was happening. Some of the brightest minds in the world were stumped. People had begun to panic. There were whispers that Simon's experiment had somehow triggered the end of the world. Some said it was the beginning of a new age. But none of them had any real answers. Then came the first public meeting, called by the U.S. government, to discuss the growing gravitational anomalies. Simon was invited to speak, but as he sat in the audience, he felt a strange disconnection from it all. He wasn't sure if he was the one to blame or the one with the answers, but in that moment, he realized he had no idea what to do anymore. Lydia had joined him on a secure video feed, and her face mirrored his own confusion. "You have to do something, Simon," she said quietly. "It's getting worse. They're talking about quarantines. You can't let them treat this as some containment protocol." But Simon wasn't sure he had the strength to stand up and tell the world what had happened. How could he explain something so bizarre? How could he make them understand the nature of the mirror world, which seemed to exist alongside their own? As the days passed, Simon became more and more disillusioned. The governments of the world were scrambling to find solutions, but their efforts were all doomed to fail. They tried to isolate the fluctuating zones, contain the effects, but each day, the anomalies grew stronger. People were starting to realize that they couldn't escape it. this mirrored reality was here to stay, and so Simon had no choice but to confront the reality of what had happened. He had created the mirror world. He had opened the door. The question now was whether to shut it, or find a way for both worlds to survive. As the two worlds collided, Simon finally made his decision. He couldn't destroy the mirror world. He couldn't go back. The choice, he realized, was about balance. And balance was something that could be achieved only by allowing both worlds to exist. But as he looked out the window, watching the world shift in strange and terrifying ways, Simon couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had created something bigger than himself, something that might change the very nature of existence, and for the first time in his life, Simon wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. Simon had already made up his mind. The mirror world was not a curse. It was not something that needed to be erased. The world he had known was breaking, eroding at the edges, suffocating beneath its own contradictions. But the mirror world, despite all its gravity-defying quirks, seemed to offer a solution. It was strange, yes. But it was also something beautiful. Something different. Something that could coexist, maybe even thrive, alongside the world they knew. But the more Simon considered this, the more the weight of that decision grew. It was no longer just an abstract idea in a lab, something to discuss in theoretical terms. The mirrored world wasn't simply an academic curiosity. It was a living thing, with its own laws, its own patterns. And Simon was its creator. But now, as the world around him began to twist in surreal ways, Simon knew there was no going back. He could feel it in the air, in the way the people walked. Their steps were lighter, their movements slower, as if time itself were playing tricks on them. The anomaly was not just affecting isolated areas anymore. It was everywhere. The boundary between the two worlds was dissolving, and there were moments, brief flashes, when objects from one world would appear in the other, distorted, flickering in and out of existence. There was no denying it now. The worlds were fusing, and there was no stopping it. He knew that. Yet he couldn't quite let go of the nagging feeling that there had to be something he could do, some way to save both worlds without them consuming each other in an unending cycle of collapse. If they merged completely, what would that even look like? Would the laws of physics tear themselves apart? Would time become irrelevant, a free-floating abstraction? Was there a chance, any chance, that the two realities could coexist in harmony? Simon was standing at the precipice of something unimaginable. He was no longer merely a scientist studying phenomena. He was a witness to the birth of a new reality, one that would forever change everything. The world, both mirrored and original, had already begun to change irrevocably. And yet, as Simon watched it unfold, there was a strange sense of inevitability, as if the moment had always been coming. Perhaps they had been building toward this for centuries, millennia. Humankind just hadn't known how to recognize it. He called Lydia again. This time, she didn't look shocked or worried. She seemed almost resigned. "I think it's happening," Simon said, his voice strained. "The two worlds are merging. There's no stopping it now. No shutting it down. We've created something that can't be undone." Lydia nodded slowly. "We've known this might happen. We both knew from the start that there was a risk this would escalate. We just didn't know how fast it would happen." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But I think it's happening for a reason. I think it was meant to happen. And now, the only question is how to move forward." "I don't know how," Simon admitted. He ran his hand through his hair, pacing in his small office, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "The government wants to contain this. They want to build a wall around it. They're talking about quarantines, restricting travel between the worlds. It's madness." Lydia's face softened. "Containment won't work. You've already seen that. The question is whether or not we try to stop this fusion or let it happen, and if we let it happen, how we make sure both worlds can coexist." Simon rubbed his eyes, trying to push back the exhaustion that was threatening to overwhelm him. I don't know if it's even possible to control it. The gravitational shifts are too erratic. People are starting to lose their sense of orientation. What if one world consumes the other entirely? What if one side of this reality becomes the dominant one? Lydia's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. What if it doesn't have to be like that? What if there's a way to let them exist side by side, without one overtaking the other? What if we could build something new from this? The idea was frightening, exhilarating, and entirely foreign. Simon had never been someone to entertain the possibility of living with a mirrored Earth. They had always been taught to believe in one truth, one reality. Anything else was pure science fiction. But Lydia's words stirred something in him. He had always wanted to make a difference, to change the world. And now, with two worlds colliding, he had the chance to do something unimaginable. The governments of the world were still scrambling, still trying to contain the shifts, still attempting to apply band-aid solutions to a problem that wasn't going to be fixed with more regulations or red tape. They couldn't see the larger picture, couldn't comprehend the nature of the phenomenon they were dealing with. Simon and Lydia were the only ones who truly understood what was happening, and it was up to them to decide what came next. "I think it's time," Simon said, his voice firm, resolute. "We stop trying to fix it, stop trying to contain it. We let both worlds exist. But we have to guide them. We can't let them collapse in on themselves. We need to find a way for them to coexist, sustainably. We have to teach people to see the mirror world as a part of our reality, not something that's threatening it." Lydia was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with the same mix of fear and hope that Simon was feeling. "It's going to be hard, Simon. People won't accept it. The governments won't accept it. They'll see it as an existential threat. But if we can show them the potential, if we can demonstrate how these two worlds can work together, maybe there's a chance." Simon nodded, the weight of their plan settling over him. This was it. There was no turning back. He had to convince the world to embrace the impossible, to see the value in what had been created, to move beyond the fear and uncertainty, and to understand that the mirror world wasn't a mistake, but a new opportunity for growth. But as Simon sat back in his chair, contemplating the monumental task ahead, he could already feel the forces of resistance growing. There would be those who would try to destroy the mirror world, just as there would be those who would fight to preserve the status quo. It would be a battle, one that would take years to resolve, but for the first time in a long while, Simon felt something he hadn't in ages: hope. The world was broken, yes. But it could be rebuilt. It could be better. The fusion of two worlds was not the end of everything, it was the beginning.